All right. Julian Assange was indicted today on what's called a superseding indictment. So, this indictment issued today will override the one issued in April, which led to his arrest in London and led to him being in custody in the UK, where he remains. But this charge is more serious because it charges Assange under the Espionage Act. And Assange is now the first publisher or individual acting in any kind of remotely journalistic capacity who's been charged under the Espionage Act since it was passed during World War I. So it's an archaic act to begin with, and is basically used when the government needs some kind of catch-all statute to trap somebody who did something they don't like that relates to a national security offense or violation, usually involving the leak of classified documents or something to that effect. The indictment is 17 counts. So this is the government basically heaping many charges on Assange to solidify their case against him. So even if one or two or three or even more of the charges get dismissed or he's acquitted on them, it's fairly likely that he'll be convicted on at least one of them. So, and just being convicted on one ensures a lengthy prison sentence. Now, I don't want to say it's any kind of foregone conclusion that he'll be successfully convicted. Who knows? Who knows if he'll even be extradited? It could take years for this to fully play out. But the precedent now entrenched as a result of this indictment is grave enough that regardless of the ultimate outcome, it should trouble anybody across the political spectrum unless you're the most unreconstructed authoritarian bootlicker, which I know some of you out there probably are. So in your case, I'm sure you're celebrating. But for people who are actually interested in preserving the First Amendment, they like the liberties enshrined by the Constitution, that kind of thing, freedom of the press. Anybody even remotely concerned with those issues should view this as an extraordinarily intrusive encroachment on those freedoms which are supposed to be protected by all sectors of the government, but now the government's obliterating them, at least in the form of the Trump Department of Justice. And let me just say one thing before I go any further on the details of the indictment. There's this strain of thinking among some segments of Trump supporters that he's constantly at war with the deep state. Now, I've said, much to the consternation of many liberals and Democrats, that yes, Trump has been targeted or impeded by elements of the permanent national security apparatus as manifest in the Russia investigation in numerous respects. But that doesn't mean that Trump also can't be carrying forth the agenda of the deep state, which is not even like a monolithic entity, really, in other respects, such as his tacit acquiescence to the prosecution of Assange. When Assange was first arrested last month, Trump pretended like he had no knowledge of Assange, even though he's caught on video on innumerable occasions in 2016 proclaiming how much he loves WikiLeaks and how much value he's deriving from the materials published by WikiLeaks. So it's a total joke that he would have no familiarity with WikiLeaks. Of course he does. WikiLeaks played a major role in the special counsel investigation, which I'm sure Trump is more than familiar with. So for him to play dumb is ridiculous. And if you're going to argue that he's somehow powerless before the deep state, it can do nothing to, protect Assange or change the investigative focus of the Department of Justice over which he presides, you're also wrong, because Trump, on more than one occasion, multiple occasions, saw fit to directly intervene in ongoing criminal investigations because he didn't like them. Or he's suggested on, again, multiple occasions that Hillary Clinton be investigated, or the investigation against Mike Flynn be dropped, or, there's chatter about how he wanted Joe Biden investigated for his son's dealings in Ukraine. So Trump has no whether it's ethical or not for him to do so, Trump has no compunction about weighing in on active criminal investigations. So this idea that he'd be hamstrung by the deep state from at least saying something about the Assange prosecution doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So, give me a break on this idea that he's somehow boxed in by these nefarious deep state actors such that he's completely hobbled from raising any objections to what's going on with Assange. I don't believe it. Here's one of the most egregious examples of how this indictment effectively seeks to criminalize ordinary journalistic conduct. And conservative journalists do this, liberal journalists do this, nonpartisan journalists do this. So it's not an ideological issue in a traditional partisan sense. Anybody who's conducting journalistic activity should be exceptionally disturbed by what prosecutors in this indictment are now asserting is criminal conduct. They write, Assange intended the most wanted leaks list, and this is a list that he had in 2009-10, basically a wish list for what he would like people to leak to WikiLeaks. Assange intended this list to, quote, encourage and cause individuals to illegally obtain and disclose protected information, including classified information, to WikiLeaks contrary to law. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, you name it, they do this as a matter of standard practice, meaning they encourage individuals to give them protected or even classified information, even when it's unlawful for those individuals to do so. And then they, as journalistic entities, are protected legally by the First Amendment, because even though their source may have committed a crime, the publishers have not committed a crime by the mere fact of publishing that illegally obtained material. And that precedent's now entirely out the window, where the New York Times or the Washington Post or even Fox News could be criminally charged for publishing classified information, or even protected information, which can mean all kinds of things. It's kind of a weasel word there. I mean, journalism would not work, at least investigative journalism would not exist unless people in sensitive positions, whether in corporate fields or in governmental fields, gave protected information to journalists because they felt that it was in the public interest to do so. I mean, that's the whole point. And yet, because people hate Assange and they don't believe that he's a journalist or whatever, he's running a hostile intelligence agency, they believe that all those standards can just go right out the window because this is just such a unique situation that it could never apply to any more traditional journalists. Well, of course it could. The way that you entrench a precedent is that you go after first somebody who's reviled, and then that gets codified into law and can be used later on against all manner of subjects. And in this indictment, it's asserted that Assange is running a hostile intelligence agency. And if you're saying that Trump himself has no culpability in this, think back to 2017 when Mike Pompeo, who was then the CIA director, gave a deranged speech announcing that it would be the policy of the intelligence community to regard WikiLeaks not as a journalistic outfit, but as a hostile intelligence service. So this was coming down the pike policy-wise for a long time. All you had to do was listen to what administration officials were saying, and it's not like Pompeo has decreased in stature since then. He's been elevated to Secretary of State, where he's doing a terrible job, and everything he does everywhere in the world is disastrous, whether it's Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, the Arctic, Russia, China. I mean, he's worse than Rex Tillerson by a long shot, even though Trump got on Twitter today and said that Tillerson was dumb as a rock. Well, he may or may not be dumb as a rock, but he was much preferable to Pompeo, who is this militaristic interventionist zealot who right now is in the process of working with his buddy John Bolton to set the stage for regime change in Iran. And you can trace Pompeo's statement in 2017 to the rationale used by prosecutors in this indictment to basically shred the Constitution and go after Assange. And it doesn't matter that Assange is not a U.S. citizen. That doesn't make a difference in this context because he's still being charged under U.S. law. And a U.S. citizen who did the same conduct could have also theoretically been charged. So in other words, Assange's lack of citizenship, or had Assange been a citizen, he would not have been protected under the rationale set forth in this indictment. So his citizenship or non-citizenship is irrelevant. If U.S. law is used against a foreign person, it could easily be used against an American individual, given the precedent that gets codified. One insane piece of this is that the DOJ is just casually asserting that the disclosures given by Chelsea Manning to Assange in 2009-10 had the effect of allowing enemy forces in Iraq and elsewhere to anticipate certain actions or responses by U.S. armed forces and to carry out more effective attacks. So basically what they're alleging is that as a result of these documents that were published on WikiLeaks, enemy forces could read them and therefore plan their attacks better. Zero evidence for this. It's made up. There is no basis whatsoever for it. I think we would have known by now, considering this happened 9-10 years ago, whether any, quote, enemy forces were in fact given strategic guidance by WikiLeaks to carry out attacks on U.S. troops. It's just never, ever been established. And Chelsea Manning went through a protracted court-martial trial in 2012-13, and that was never established, even though they wanted to get Manning on all kinds of charges relating to that. And the most absurd is that the DOJ, again, trots out this nonsense that Assange effectively aided Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda by publishing documents because after bin Laden's compound was raided in 2011 and he was killed, the U.S. recovered evidence that bin Laden had requested that material published by WikiLeaks be provided to him. And just think about that. The New York Times publishes all kinds of stories on U.S. government activity that some terrorist somewhere or some adversary or enemy force could theoretically request. It doesn't mean the New York Times is responsible for whatever they may do with it. And either way, there's no evidence at all that bin Laden or Al-Qaeda was materially benefited by any of this. And you know how we know that? But it was because in the 2013 court-martial trial for Manning, they tried to charge her on aiding the enemy on account of Al-Qaeda somehow being bolstered by the materials that Manning furnished. And you know what happened? Manning was acquitted on that charge because prosecutors could not establish it. And yet they're trotting it out again 6 years later to get Assange. I mean, Manning was obviously convicted on other charges, but not the most serious aiding the enemy charge. And yet they're using the same logic that was unsuccessfully used against Manning against Assange. And it's even more egregious, arguably, with Assange because it has all these implications for press freedom, whereas Manning wasn't operating in a journalistic capacity or a publishing capacity. She was a source. It's the first time in history that anybody, a journalist, a publisher, etc., has been charged under the Espionage Act. And it should really be worrying to everybody, regardless of where you are on the spectrum. The government doesn't get to define who is or is not a journalist. The First Amendment applies to all citizens and governs all U.S. law, irrespective of whether you're a properly credentialed journalist. Any guy walking down the street can commit an act of journalism. You don't need to pass an exam. You don't need to get some kind of, credential from your local agency or anything. It's just a basic right everybody has. So anybody can tweet journalism. Anybody can start a publishing press. Anybody can do YouTube. Years ago, anybody could start a mail newsletter. It's just a basic right to which all citizens are entitled. And again, just because Assange is a non-citizen doesn't mean that the applicability of U.S. law is any different in that respect. Anyway, so once again, you have the sick spectacle of Democrats cheering because they so desperately crave revenge on Assange for everything that happened in 2016, to the point that they're willing to cheer the Trump Department of Justice for inventing a new theory that effectively criminalizes journalistic practice. They don't care. They just want to go after Assange. And then, of course, you have a certain segment of pro-Trump authoritarian, bootlickers also cheering this, even though they, in 2016, were cheering Assange because it happened to advance their political interests at the time. So I think there's massive hypocrisy on both sides for slightly different reasons, but it doesn't make it any less of a grotesque of a spectacle. So more to say on this, obviously, as things unfold, and I'll talk to you later.